Lynch is known as one of the most expressive cinematic sound artists in the history of the medium, and when the sound work is coupled with his indelible imagery, the result often has the power to transport you like no other films. Tonight, we discuss Lynch's particular brilliance with sound with two of the finest and most prolific sound technicians in the industry. Douglas Murray has nearly 60 film credits to his name, performing sound duties on films like Species, Contact, The English Patient, and Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, for which his team won the 2006 Golden Reel Award. His latest work can be heard in the forthcoming release of We Own the Night, starring Robert Duvall, Joaquin Phoenix, and Mark Wahlberg. In 1992, Murray served as the supervising sound editor on David Lynch's film Twin Peaks: Fire Walk with Me. Mark Wlodarkiewicz served as an assistant sound editor on that same film. Wlodakiewicz's vast film credits include work on Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, Wag the Dog, Armageddon, Deja Vu, and Walk the Line. He's won 2 Golden Reel Awards, one for his work in Walk the Line, and another as music editor of the Mothman Prophecies. It is a great pleasure to welcome these distinguished craftsmen to our show, Douglas and Mark. Let me see if I can get you up here on the switchboard. Douglas and Mark, are you guys there?
Hello.
Yes.
Oh, great. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for being on the show today.
Well, thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm especially pleased to have you both on the show with us tonight because, personally, I think that Fire Walk With Me is one of the most astounding examples of sound in film. And Douglas, I know you worked as a supervising sound editor on that film, and Mark as an assistant sound editor.
Mm-hmm.
What do those positions entail exactly?
Well, in the case of the supervising sound editor, it's a you're responsible to coordinate all the sound for the film, except for the music, really.
Right.
It's the supervisor's job to hire the crew and make sure the tracks are delivered to the mix in a way that the director wants. So, for any film, that's the case.
Right.
There's, a lot of work that is typically done by the supervising sound editor that could also be described as sound design or whatever on some films, depending on the nature of the film. The assistant, Mark, in this case, worked very closely with me on the sound of the film, and I did a lot of work designing sounds that were in the film. David, is the sound designer of record and did have a huge impact on the track, as I'm sure he has on all of his films.
Yeah. How would you, Mark? How would you rate Lynch in terms of a filmmaker who understands and is kind of innovative with the use of sound in his movies?
Well, at the time, it was very much at the beginning of my career, so I didn't really know how much this all worked. I mean, it was literally the 3rd film I worked on with Doug, and I had just started out. I came out of theater sound, so it was just this crazy thing. And one thing I have to say is, having it being at the beginning of my career, it's kind of taught me you can be extremely free about manipulating sound. And from that point on, several years later, I started doing music editing, and it's kind of what I'm known as now. But at the time, I would say he gave us tremendous permission to, excuse the cliche, but think out the box. And almost every sound in that film was, created from an organic, actual element. I mean, one of the things that I was involved with specifically was going out in the field and recording things, and beating up boxcars and breaking glass, and trying to create all the sort of specific elements. Me and a couple other people, a guy named Phil Benson and Steve Kearney, were constantly running around recording stuff. And we would make these libraries and hand them over to Doug and Donnie Blank, and they would do the editorial and manipulate and do all this sort of crazy stuff to it. And then of course David. Then there would be the whole David layer, which would be move this around and pitch it down 10 octaves and all that kind of crazy stuff. So it was all very, there was just a tremendous permission to present something that, even though it was organic, that had no relationship to the thing that you thought it was going to be. And in terms of other directors, some directors are very laissez-faire, they kind of just want you to show up and make the film sound good. And other directors, want to detail everything. My memory is that David was more hands-on than most. There's definitely more hands-on than most. And of course, as his career has progressed, that meant really doing it all himself.
So, but was he someone that, you've spoken to this, he's someone that knew exactly what he wanted, but he still allowed you room to create? I'm wondering what the creative process was like when you were working with him. Was he very communicative about what exactly he wanted?
Well, let me answer that one. I would say that David, I believe that David does not know what he wants until he is actually working on it, right. At least in terms of the sound. In other words, he knew the kinds of elements that he would like to hear in the movie and the kinds of moods he wanted to create. But when we got to the final mix and he was there, in fact, he's definitely the most hands-on director in terms of sound that I've ever worked with, because he wants to make as much of the sound himself as possible. He was the music mixer on Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, and he likes to improvise. I think he's probably more like an abstract painter in terms of the way he works with sound, or a painter, I should say. He looks at the canvas of the film and tries to think as we're mixing it, what does it want now at this point? And then he will give direction, which is often completely unexpected. In spite of the fact that we've talked about the scene before and we've worked on it, and I would have asked him questions and he would give guidance, and then we would get to the mix. And he would, you could say change his mind, or he would get a new idea. He would come up with something completely different, and we would make it up on the spot. I have to say that I worked with him twice. I worked with him on the pilot as well.
Oh,
and on the pilot for Twin Peaks, we didn't have that luxury. He told me what he wanted, and I prepared it, and we mixed it in with very little fuss. There were a few things we worked out in the mix, but we didn't have time to do a lot of sound design work during the mix. Mm-hmm. But on Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, it was a much larger budget. We had several weeks instead of the 1 week we had on the pilot to mix it. So we spent a lot of time in the mix. I had this newfangled technique of the sampler, the Emulator 3 it was, which is a MIDI-controlled sampler, which we set up in the mix with a lot of the sounds we knew he wanted to be in the film that we had cut into the film. And then we performed things live directly into the track, as he came up with these ideas.
Mm. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of natural kind of environmental sounds in his films. But I'm thinking, too, about the indoor scenes, of course. There seems to be a low kind of rumbling hum that permeates a lot of those scenes. How are his sounds generally created?
Well, everything kind of starts from an organic place. And, working up at Saul Zaentz, there was definitely a technique of, not going to a library, for example. We went out and did a tremendous amount of recording. Mm-hmm. And, at the time, as Doug was saying, that, samplers were just coming online and digital techniques were just coming online for editorial. And so we would just create these libraries, we were talking about earlier, actually I'm sitting in Doug's backyard, it's kind of funny. We're having this conversation. We were going to tell you this later, I guess, but we were discussing this for about an hour beforehand. I was like, oh, what are we going to talk about? But we had made these tremendous libraries of sound, and so I would go out and beat up a boxcar, and we would record it. And there's actually a story about Steve Kearney and I breaking into the Alameda train yard in the middle of the night and finding a boxcar and, just literally kicking the shit out of it and finding as many little things to, manipulate and things. So we'd go back, we would take our DATs, we would record them into the computer, and then we would make libraries of individual sounds and then hand them off to the editors, in which case they would just start manipulating them. And of course the standard sound design manipulation is you pitch everything down, put you down a couple octaves, and it gets very mysterious. And, one of David's, and actually a lot of people who went through Salt Dance at the time, there's these train squeals that we had, and you pitch those way down, and you get this incredible metallic, organic tonalities that, are just Lynchian by their inherent nature.
Right.
So I don't think there's really not too much stuff that was basically synthetic that came from a synthesizer or anything like that. And they all started as sort of organic sounds. Even his manipulation of music was very organic. He would take recordings and like Penderecki and pitch it way down, and you get these tones that you just simply couldn't synthesize. So even though nothing felt quote-unquote real, most of it came from real stuff. And then there's the whole world of Angelo Da Laurentiis, and his stuff is very synthetic, and I think that's how it differentiates itself sonically from in the palette, is that the world is organic and the emotional context of the music is actually highly synthetic.
Right. Badalamenti's score always contributes so much to his films, the mood of his films. Did you put that score in, or did you work with the score at all in your duties as a sound designer on the film?
In the case of Twin Peaks, Fire Walk with Me, it was Laurie Eschler who was the music editor and had been the music editor on the Twin Peaks series, TV series. And she had this cool machine that was pretty advanced at the time, an SSL Screen Sound it was called, which is a digital audio workstation that had a hard disk that could play back maybe 8 tracks at a time. And it had a light pen. It was like, Pro Tools or something now, only at the time this was one of the early machines. So she could take the sounds that had been written for the film and quickly take them from a list and place them anywhere in the scene, in any scene. And he would frequently, during the mix, ask for, again, unexpected music to appear in places that it wasn't envisioned originally. And often, played at half speed or backwards or overlaying several cues at once. And she was able to do that with this machine fairly quickly. It would have been much, much more time-consuming to do it on magnetic film, which was the dominant technology at the time.
Right. His sound seems to, and maybe it's all those effects that you spoke of, but more than any other director, his sound seems to kind of seep into your subconscious in a way. And I know that he likes the sound level to be loud. Is that correct? Or?
Well, I have to tell you a story about that. This film was mixed for Dolby Stereo, which is an optical analog format, surround sound format, which was the only one available really at the time. So it has a limit, a loudness limit, which was considered plenty loud, but it's much quieter than what you can do with a modern digital track. It's probably 10 or 15 dB quieter. So he wanted the scene in the Roadhouse back room, the music, to be as loud as possible.
Right.
And I don't think he is into loud for its own sake. There's a lot of dynamics in the film. There are quiet scenes, lots of them. But when he wants it loud, he wants it loud. And that music is pretty driving, and he wanted it to be as loud as possible. And there's a dialogue scene in the middle of that room during the music, and the mixer, David Parker, who is an unsung genius of film sound, turned to David and said, as he kept saying, no, louder. No, it's still not loud enough. Turn it up as loud as it can possibly go. And then let's hear that. And then he did, and he said, okay, that's how loud I want it. And David said, well, there's no way we're going to understand the dialogue then. this is a dialogue scene. We have to be able to hear the dialogue. Shall I just pull it down under the dialogue? No. Leave it as loud as it goes. So they ended up, as you know, subtitling the scene so that you could hear understand what they were saying, even though you can't really hear it very well.
Or understand it, actually.
It doesn't make a lot of sense, but...
Well, that's a